I would say, evangelistic seminar where an evangelist made a claim. There are over 600 prophecies in the Bible which talk about, in the Old Testament, which talk about Jesus. I saw a large audience of several thousand people applauded to this. And as a Jew, I looked at this with a little bit of a grain of skepticism. Later, many times, I had examples, something like this. I would come to a nice, lively and lovely Christian church, such as Caribbean church, and I would begin to quote something from the book of Leviticus. And usually there is something about the sacrificial animal, such as lamb, and I would always, from the lively Caribbean audience, hear something like this. The moment I read something and he will place his hand over the lamb, I would hear this kind of lively, "That is Jesus!" Nice. Why? No answer. We take certain things for granted. We are raised with this. But when we encounter people who are actually not raised with this understanding, that's when many Christians begin to realize this is not that kind of obvious. And so I begin to see many Christian scholars who begin to teach now that this statement in Isaiah actually is not about the Messiah. This is actually not about Jesus. And I can see that these scholars did encounter rabbis and Jewish scholars who basically told them, look at the context of the Old Testament, and it's taken out of context. So this is why during this seminar we're going to look at the context. There are, of course, the statement about 600 prophecies is definitely far-fetched. But there are 3 major prophecies and the similar passages which I will invite you to study during this seminar to discover whether or not the New Testament takes liberty to quote the Old Testament out of context. And whether or not Jesus' claim about him being divine Messiah is actually legitimate. Does Christian faith in Jesus of Nazareth actually have foundation? This is what we are going to study over the course of this seminar. And I apologize for our layout today, that our slides are going to be on that screen, but today's topic is Messiah. What is he? In your handouts, it was initially Messiah, who is he? But it is more appropriate to start with Messiah, what is he? Basic definition of what Messiah is. Well, it was Sabbath in the synagogue of Nazareth, as the book of Luke describes. Jesus comes to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as his custom was, he goes into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stands up to read. This passage tells us something about Jesus and his culture and who he was. There are many discussions among today's different literature. Why is it that the Gospel of Luke notoriously omits the youth of Jesus? Luke talks about Jesus' birth. Then he talks about his coming at the age of 12, 13 at the temple. Basically describes his preparation to bar mitzvah, because that's exactly where his parents found him, at the temple. And then off he disappears for 13 years. This gives the reason to some writers to claim that Jesus was somewhere else. Some suggest that he was among the Essenes on the shores of the Dead Sea at Qumran. Others say that he even went to Tibet to learn from Tibetan monks. If this was the case, Jesus would not have been given an honorable task to read from the scripture at the synagogue. We have to remember that 1st century AD is still illiterate society. The majority of the working people don't have knowledge to read scripture. Only few people who actually learned at the synagogue and are known to the community are given the honor to read. So it says here that he was handed the book of the prophet Isaiah. If we know something about the tradition of scripture reading at the synagogues, we know that in the synagogue they would read the weekly Torah portion known as a parasha, and then they would read a corresponding portion from the book of the prophets, which is Haftarah. Haftarah means conclusion. Usually, the service goes like this. The Torah is read, and Rabbi comments on it. Then, somebody who reads Haftarah provides a little sermonette of encouragement known as Nehemta. So it says here in Luke chapter 4, verse 17, that Jesus had opened the book and found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he had anointed me to preach the good news to the poor. He had sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord." This passage is coming from the book of Isaiah, chapter 61. There are two basic schedules of scripture reading which is used today and was used in the past. There is a yearly cycle of Torah reading. This means that the entire Torah from Genesis to Deuteronomy is read over the 52 weeks of the year, and of course it is very difficult to fit all the portions from the prophets, but it is also it's a yearly cycle. There is also a triennial cycle, 3 years. During the 3 years, what they do, they take a parasha, for example, the first parasha of the book of Genesis is Bereshith, and it's from Genesis 1:1 to 6:8. On a yearly cycle, they would read it over the period of 1 week. And during the Sabbath, they would read it. In triennial cycle, they would break this into 3 sections. Section 1, basically Genesis 1 and 2, is read in the first year. Section 2 would be read in the second year, and section 3 in the third year. So what basically happens is this in the triennial cycle. They would take the first parasha, Genesis 1 through 6:8. Then second parasha, which is Noah, is 6:9 through 11:31. And they would keep breaking this parashot into 3 sections. What they would do, they would take Genesis 1 and 2, if it's year 1. Then the next week, they would jump into Genesis 6 and 7, leaving Genesis 3, 4, and to the second year. But this way, they can fit almost all prophets into the reading. In other words, this is the way how you can, over 3 years, cover most of the text of the Hebrew Bible. It is known to the scholars that annual cycle of Torah reading was used in Jerusalem, whereas triennial cycle, 3-year cycle, was used in Galilee. This is why when Jesus came up to read, and this was an honorable assignment, he was reading not a random text. He didn't read what he wanted to read. He read specifically what was scheduled to be read. And looking at the schedule known to us, this was a reading from the second year, and this reading was somewhere around the June feast of 2 weeks before the Feast of Pentecost. So basically, we know when the events actually happen. So Luke continues describing the situation. Then he closed the book, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. And the eyes of all who were in the synagogue were fixed on him. No wonder. The one who reads Haftarah is supposed to give a little sermonette. But he didn't. He kind of sat down, so everybody is, are you going to tell us some little encouragement? Well, he did. He stood up and he said, today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. That was a little shocking. Was it? It says in Luke chapter 4, so all who bore witness to him and marveled at the gracious word proceeded out of his mouth, and they said, is this not Joseph's son? Why was the question like this? We have to understand what Nazareth actually was. Tomorrow, by the way, we will talk a little more about basically the village of Nazareth. But today, I will cite to you an ancient Christian historian, Africanus, who writes in his chronicles that Nazareth was the place where descendants of David who came later from the Babylonian captivity actually settled. Let me unpack this. Everybody probably is aware that the ancestral land of David was Bethlehem. But if you begin reading the story of Davidic kings, you will realize very soon that after himself, David left many descendants. He had several wives. They bore children. There was only one line that was royal. And of course, every king had several wives. And they had children. So we're talking about a good number. I would say by the first century, we're having easily over 50,000 people who could claim themselves to be a descendants of David. Of course, we know that in 586 BC, Jerusalem and the temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, and Jews spent 70 plus years in Babylonian captivity. One of the first descendants of David, by the name Zerubbabel, left the first returnees from Babylon back to the ruins of Judea. Was very uncomfortable, and that's why not so many people came. Then, almost 80 years later, in 457 BC, Ezra, the scribe and the priest, led another large group of returnees. And then 13 years later, another group of returnees from Babylon came with Nehemiah. And very possible there were more returnees over the centuries that were coming to their land of Judea and Galilee. It is obvious that Bethlehem was too small to house and to feed all descendants of David. That's why Jews began to actually settle in Galilee. Galilee was not an ancestral land of the descendants of Judah. It was the land that belonged to the northern tribes, such as Zebulun and Naphtali. But in 622 BC, a Syrian king, as it is described in 2 Kings chapter 17, took the 10 tribes of northern kingdom of Israel, who basically paganized themselves through worshiping all kinds of gods and not attending the temple in Jerusalem, took them to Assyria. Some were northeast direction, where they gradually over centuries assimilated. The vacant land was settled by people whom King of Assyria brought from Mesopotamia. These people are called Samaritans. And when Jews returned from Babylonian captivity, Samaritans definitely didn't welcome them. And they were, because while the Mesopotamians, known as Samaritans, lived for 100 years side by side north of Judah, when the land of Judah became vacant due to the Babylonian invasion and captivity, of course, Samaritans claimed it. Over the century, there were conflicts between Jews and Samaritans. Eventually, Jews were able to push Samaritans into the more mountainous region, today known as Samaria, but Galilee became open. And as soon as Galilee became open, more Jews from Babylon began to come back. This is probably when the rest of the family of David came back from Babylon, and since Bethlehem was too overcrowded, they founded a new settlement for themselves somewhere around 2nd century BC, and called this settlement as Nazareth, or in English, Nazareth. So Jesus spoke to his relatives. Those who sat in the synagogue during that Sabbath at which Jesus read these Haftarah portions, they were not strangers to him. They were all descendants of David. And so did Jesus. His mother had his lineage from David, according to Luke chapter 3. And we will talk in our seminar about Jesus' genealogy in greater details. And Joseph, who, according to the gospel, was not his biological father, was from the lineage of David. And that's why they asked this question: is he not Joseph's son? The answer is actually not. He is not. That's what the Gospels say. But why are they asking this question? Well, think about this. Every Jew knows that Messiah is supposed to be the son of David. So, think about this. If there are 50,000 descendants of David living in Judea of the first century, anybody could actually claim the Messiahship. It's going to be legitimate. I mean, of course, as we can say, there is one famous Russian cartoon about one captain who said, every herring is a fish, but not every fish is herring. So, this is where the problem lies. Every descendant of David could potentially be the Messiah. But there is only one who actually is the true Messiah. I mean, it's all easy. If he's not the descendant of David, then it's excluded automatically. But if a person is proven to be descendant of David, very well could possibly be. Well, why are they asking this? They're basically saying, we don't know who your real father is. Number one, you're not the most noble and the most rich of us. Your mother is not a descendant of David from the royal line. And Joseph, who actually is a descendant of David through the royal line, actually is not your father. So you can't claim it. You gotta be, you gotta have a audacity to do this. How dare could you? I mean, we respect you. many people say, but look, I am a little closer. You know how they had this royal disputes in England and in other countries? It's who is the closest genetically. So that's the question. That's the nature of the debate. And we will be going over this in our later seminar. But what I would like to ask question as of right now is, what's actually Messiah? Why is the Messiah? What does the word actually mean? And what is its significance? I remember many years ago when I worked in New York, I had an interesting discussion with one Sephardic rabbi who told me, we don't really need Messiah. Why is there a need for Messiah? Everybody talks about Messiah. Isn't God who is supposed to save us? So, do we really need Messiah? And if we do, why? This question will be answered after a short break where you're going to have a little snack.